So this is future Chris. I want to correct something that I said in the video that's not right. It's not right at all. Um, so with regards to at the end, I talk a little bit about carbon-14 dating and how um, our view of it is based on that uniformalist kind of view about the planet. But with regards to the collection, what ideally you would want to see is actually more data points scrunched up closer together uh, around the 4,000 year ago mark. And then beyond that, you want to start seeing a stretch. So that's where you want to see the points actually becoming rapidly, though, more and more distant um, as you go out from that point further back into the past. So I just want to point that out. So there's definitely a pattern that you can see there, but I want to also emphasize, remember, there's an idea of where you would apply carbon-14 dating and a belief of where um, it is best applied, and again to date things that are really exceptionally old, because it fits the model better if you believe that the Earth is millions and millions and millions of years old. It's going to tend to support that idea rather than trying to focus on shorter term goals that might show a collection, especially around 4,000 years ago. You know, so you know, it's not that science doesn't believe that is something uh, special about 4,000 years ago, but with regards to what you want to date and pushing things back, you're going to see a bigger spread as you go back further in time, because all those points really should be pushed and collected, and much more compressed, if you will, between the, filling in a gap, of roughly 6,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago, rather than going from 4,000 years ago to millions of years ago or whatever. I mean, I know a lot of the carbon-14 dating is not going to necessarily take you back that far, but into the tens of thousands or 100,000 or whatever estimated years ago, um, as far as the data point goes. So I just want to clarify that, clear that up, my mistake, and hopefully you won't get too hung up on my error. But I wanted to put that in there. Thanks. So I thought I'd do something short. So I promise I'll get back to something a little bit more interesting. This one's interesting. So, or something maybe you haven't thought a lot about. So, for me, um, as a believer and as somebody who places their faith and trust in Jesus Christ and also the Word of God, a lot of times, especially somebody has a kind of a scientific and mathematical background like I do, we oftentimes get kind of laughed at, right? Because of our faith. And the idea is aren't you too smart to fall for uh, something mythological like God? And of course, as a believer in Jesus Christ, I know what I know and I know it's true. And the Holy Spirit is inside of me. And so I bear witness of the glory of God through Jesus Christ that's inside of me. But we're not going to do a big gospel or good news presentation here. This one's probably more for the believer. This is going to be about those frustrations dealing with people, or maybe even your internal frustration as somebody who might be into science and everything, and you're like, there's things that I wrestle with regards to the Bible and what it says with regards to things like creation and early times in Scripture. And so I'm going to mention some of those things. I'm not going to go into detail. We're not going to look at the passages directly, but I'm going to focus. The passage I'm going to focus on, you're going to go, that went way off the path. Just hold with me, okay? So let's see what happens here. So, when it comes to creation in the Bible, God says that He created the earth, and it was those 6 days of creation, and then on the seventh day He rested. And we've already talked about how God, because of His nature, as being a non-creation, okay, kind of lives outside of the essence of everything that we know to be true about created things. Okay, so uh, so there is this kind of awesomeness, and we've talked about this before, with regards to who God is, because we pointed out that because even concepts that we have, He can't be defined in the same physical terms that we would use to describe things that we can touch and feel and see and hear and taste and everything, with our senses and everything. And even with our own knowledge, we can't use that to adequately, put God in some kind of box and say, well, here He is, right? Because there's no way for us, uh, uh, as we are, to be able to even know, right? So I think that gets back to that whole awesomeness about who God is. But um, if you look at the great, some of the problems, with creation, besides science saying there's no way the Earth could be created in 6 days, and then if you do any kind of genealogy kind of math, going by the history of man and the ages of which people lived, going back even to the ones that lived for long periods of time early on, after Adam and Eve. Uh, if you go back and try to do some calculation, you end up with this what we call a very young Earth model, which means the Earth is not, where science would tell you the Earth has to be millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years old. um, we come back, as believers doing what I would call, you know, biblical math, and come back with a young Earth uh, proposition that, the Earth is actually extremely young. Um, and usually at the crux of that as to why um, science and biblical uh, telling from God's word, why they differ so much, hinges on one event in particular. And the event that I'm talking about is the flood. Okay. So if you look at science, or just if you just look at history in general, you're going to find some interesting things. One of the interesting things you're going to see is with regards to what I call um, the first. And by the first, I mean in terms of first as far as what we as a whole in humanity, believer or non believer, tend to declare as the first time we saw this, like the first doctor or the first, I've seen references to the first veterinarian. I've seen, first writings, first uh, schools, things like that. And inevitably, what you're going to find is that these items date back approximately 4,000 years. Now, you're going to find a couple of outliers that date back farther than that, but in generally speaking, you're going to find that there's something interesting that happened approximately 4,000 years ago. And what is that event that happened approximately 4,000 years ago? And that would be the flood. So, so we have a young Earth approximation model from a biblical perspective, that, puts the Earth's age at, around 6,000 years or so. Maybe I'll swing you 1,000 years or so, right? But the idea is that that's laughable, when you're going up against scientists who were going to claim millions and millions, this has got to be hundreds of millions of years old or whatever. Um, that's a pretty big difference. So, um, from a biblical perspective, things changed with the flood. If you read the Bible, and we're not going to go into this passage, but I think it is interesting. The Bible tells us that uh, before Noah built his ark, there was no such thing as rain on the earth. But God would cause this mist to come up from the ground, to water everything. The world was actually significantly different. Now, some biblical scientists have postulated or hypothesized that, and again, we see this. So there are verses when it talks about the flood, it talks about God tearing open the floodgates of the heavens, as well as water coming up from the deep in order to flood the entire earth. And so some believe that that ripping open, especially in the heavens, meant that there was a very large source of water, possibly encompassing the entire earth. And I think that that's interesting from a hypothesis point of view, because if you know anything about what it would take to take and create kind of a universal climate on the planet, a greenhouse-like barrier would probably be what you'd want to see. And so if this water, they call it a water canopy, existed, way up high in the sky, and we didn't have clouds, okay, there was no such thing as clouds, but we had instead this kind of barrier, that surrounded the atmosphere, um, it would actually help produce, kind of a universal climate. Now, what that climate was like, I can't tell you. It could be very tropical, but a lot of people also say that such a container may have given weight or pressurization to the atmosphere such that uh, atmospheric pressure was much higher during that time period. Now, all this is going to take a scientist, and they're going to go, that's just not true. The way the Earth has been is the way it's always been, and that's why we can safely say that the Earth is, however millions of years old it is, because they take what we call a very uniform Earth view. The Earth that you live on today is just a natural progression of how it has always been. Now, they will tell you that, like, with regards to dinosaurs, they'll create a cataclysmic event, and they might even time it around 4,000 years ago because of all those firsts that we already talked about, which we're kind of all in agreement about. So they may say there was some kind of cataclysmic thing that happened 4,000, a little over 4,000 years ago, but they won't identify it as the flood, and they wouldn't never tell you there was some kind of weighty water canopy over the top of the atmosphere and a very much of a higher pressure environment during that day. As a kid, I loved dinosaurs, by the way. And so when I was growing up, I couldn't get enough of dinosaur books and had all these dinorama models of dinosaurs. They're big, My dad put a big piece of plywood in my bedroom so I could build my models and glue them all together and everything. And of course, they went through the entire period of what science would call prehistoric history, with regards to man and Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man, but also back to all your dinosaurs and Triceratops and Allosauruses and T-Rex. And I had all these, the saber-toothed tiger, I had all these different models, but also had a model that didn't stand alone, but was actually something you would suspend, using like fishing line into your model space, and that was of the pterodactyl. And so back when I was a kid, the pterodactyl, in fact, this is true for actually most of my life, just letting you know. So this is a very recent retelling of the story by science, and I'll tell you why they had to retell it. And so it'll kind of make sense. So you watch old movies, you watch the old cartoon, or not cartoon, but the old children's show on Saturday morning called Land of the Lost, or anything like that. You're going to get introduced to this idea of these flying reptiles. Um, but science recently came back and said that's impossible. Okay, so given the size and the weight of the bird, it would just not be possible for a pterodactyl to fly. So our pterodactyl that I grew up with, flying through the air, uh, not too many years ago, was declared to be an impossibility by science. What they said instead is that its wing structure, rather than being so much of a wing structure, was more like a webbing structure between hands and feet, much like a flying squirrel would be, and that the pterodactyl would climb up, and they don't give much explanation for this, by the way, but it would climb, because it can't fly, remember, cannot fly, so it would climb up to the top of large mountains because of its size, and then it would glide down like a flying squirrel would. And I'm not kidding you. This is contemporary, today's, this is what kids are going to be taught today in school with regards to the pterodactyl. Okay? Are you with me on this? All right, so things have changed. You say, well, science doesn't change. Yeah, and scientists, of course, say science does change all the time because we become smarter, right? So they're thinking that people are evolving into smarter human beings and not devolving over time. Okay, and you can probably guess where I'm going with regards to humanity, but I would say that perhaps we're not as smart as we used to be. And it's kind of funny when you look at their amazement at the structures and the pyramids, and we kind of talked about that. You look at some of these things and the great obelisks that they create out of granite, and they're just absolutely huge, and they would actually be able to take these things, and without contemporary or modern vehicles, they would actually be able to transport these large distances, put them on boats, and ship them, and everything. And like we can't do half that much today, right? And it's kind of laughable in a way to look at these people and say, yeah, they sure were dumb. I wish they were as smart as we are. When it seems like maybe they had a little bit more smarts than we did with regards to these things, and that's why they were able to accomplish some of the things they did. Anyway, I'm off topic on this, but my point is with regards to the flood, is that uh, these atmospheric pressure differences. So think about it this way. So so in other words, what I'm basically trying to tell you is the air was highly pressurized and a lot thicker than it is today. And so when you think about, so I'm going to put it in kind of some simplistic terms that you probably can understand, right? And not because you're stupid or anything. What I'm trying to say is mankind sometimes needs a simple model to maybe embrace the possibility of getting this pterodactyl off the ground. Um, but when you swim in water, how are you able to keep yourself afloat? Even if you don't float very well, because, based on your density and everything, you may not be able to be one of those people that can actually lay down on their back or whatever and float really well in the water, you know. And of course, anyone who's been in the water, you also know that, like, if you went underwater and then you were to release all of the air out of your lungs while you're down low, you're going to find that you can stay lower longer, right? Without the air inside of you trying to push you up to the surface, right? But how do you tread water when you're sinking? And you know that you can move your hands and your feet in such a way that you're basically able to push against the water, which is not necessarily very solid, right? But if you do it fast enough, you can kind of keep up, right? And you're, if you will, going to our pterodactyl model, you're more or less learning how to fly in water. Does that make sense? So you're not going to crash. You're going to actually tread water. So think about it that way. A heavier atmosphere, a very thick, heavy atmosphere, no clouds, remember, mist, you know, watering everything on the surface of the earth at the time. This is how a pterodactyl could fly. So if the atmosphere was a whole lot thicker than today, and we had a whole lot more atmospheric pressure, we might find that the air itself is more conducive to the flight of our giant reptile friend that we are now told could never have flown. And I'm like, that anyway. The whole premise seems kind of ridiculous to me. So I know we're going a little bit outside of the Bible here and getting into hopefully some things to just consider and think about, because I can't tell you, what, if there was really this water layer thing. I mean, we read something in scripture and now we kind of create a nice hypothesis. I just think that there is some worth to considering this hypothesis because it also helps answer our pterodactyl problem. Remember, it wasn't a problem when I was a kid. When I was a kid, pterodactyls were flying everywhere as far as science was concerned. It was only when they kind of proved that this thing cannot fly that they determined, okay, we're going to have to change its structure. When you have skeleton, you can do that. You can create, you know, larger, more glidey looking wings, this webbing that stretches from hands to feet rather than wings, and create this kind of gliding concept. And we already see that in nature with things like the flying squirrel, for example. So we already have some things to kind of like justify that from a super intelligent human point of view, right? So anyway, so I'm just saying that if we look at those hypotheses that a lot of creation scientists use, we can get our pterodactyl off the ground again. If that's interesting. I think it's kind of interesting. But you say, well, this is all like extracurricular biblical stuff. It's not, but it's stuff to think about. It's stuff to think about. So, but the verse I'll lay on you kind of supports this as well. So after the ark lands, and the water start drying up and everything, and it's time for our people from the ark, for Noah and sons and their wives, to leave the ark. So let's start in Genesis chapter 9, verse 18. This is going to be short. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah. And from these the whole earth was populated. So we get this idea of a new beginning, right? We already talked about this 4,000 years ago, all these firsts, right? Verse 20 is where, 20 and 21 are the what I want to focus on. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. So far, nothing wrong with this, right? He drank some of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside the tent. So verse 21 is, I think, a bigger verse than most people realize. Now, the following verses go on to describe, that maybe, one of the brothers here, Ham, may have been a little bit, he did something, and it could be nasty even, because we have this idea of the other two brothers taking a blanket and walking backwards so they would not see Noah and quote unquote the nakedness of their father and cover him up. So I don't think it's natural what is happening here. I think there's a lot to it that we don't fully understand. Okay? But the thing that I want to focus on is he got drunk. And you're like, well, aren't they welcome to get drunk? I mean, they went through a huge ordeal and everything. I want to stipulate that this was a surprise. So again, I'm kind of going on that hypothetical edge here a little bit, but to support kind of what we've been talking about. Because if you know, or maybe you know, that as you go into like a high altitude region, what do they always tell you with regards to alcohol consumption? They always warn you that it's going to have more of an effect at higher altitude, where the air is thinner and everything. Now, for these folks, if we're right about our hypothesis here that the Earth had a higher density, thicker atmosphere with higher pressure levels, um, it couldn't be more thinner. Does that make sense? So, from their perspective, the atmosphere radically changed. In fact, some would argue, and I don't think that this is necessarily wrong either, that what happened to a lot of our prehistoric animals of the age is that over time they failed to adapt to this very, very, very different environment that they were in. So, animals, in other words, had to adapt to this very thin atmosphere as all the waters, came down from this, shield surrounding the Earth, and suddenly the atmospheric pressure was so much less than it was before. Yes, indeed, perhaps our poor pterodactyl friend can no longer fly, so it's going to die off pretty quickly. But it could have affected the much of the other animal life that we do not see today because they were failure to adapt to what would have been an incredibly radical world. But I think it took Noah by surprise too. So even though he was able to adapt, and we don't have a lot of information about how radically different his world was, except this statement, and I think that maybe the statement might have more to it. The fact that he planted a vineyard, drank some of the wine, and became drunk. And I think that was a surprise. Okay. Um, I mean, you think about it, and you're like, well, how much time passed here, so that uh, so he could make wine from his vineyard. The vineyard's got to grow, it's got to produce, and it's quite possible that these events took place rather quickly. Again, because of the changes, on the earth. And so there may have been just a lot of things that were just totally surprising to him. But I think that when he drank the wine from his planted vineyard and got drunk, perhaps that was a big surprise because normally that wouldn't happen. And it's in that events happened, perhaps, you know, we're talking the first time Noah's ever been drunk. Okay. And we have this event dealing with, and we don't know all the details with Noah's nakedness, but it was obviously considered at the time to be heinously bad, right? Um, so this was, and so let's go ahead and I guess read that just because it's interesting. So Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Okay, so he saw, quote, the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I would think naked man is not something that they were like unfamiliar with. Okay? So there may be a lot more meaning to this than just that, right? But let's take it for what it is there, or how it's written. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both of their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Let me read that again. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So we're given this presentation that Ham saw the nakedness of his father, and then Noah, when he wakes up, he said he knew what his youngest son had done to him. And so that's why I think that, maybe some things or some concepts here are lost in translation. And so then Noah says, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servant, he shall be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. And it says Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Um, so there's a lot here to unpack, but we notice that this was a pretty serious thing. So whatever this means about Ham seeing the nakedness of his father, the brothers being so serious about it, they couldn't dare not even look at whatever this is that's happening to Noah. Walk backwards and put the blanket to cover him. Okay, and so, but we get the idea when it says that he knew what the youngest son had done to him, and I don't think it was like, oh, he saw me kind of a thing. There could be a lot more to this, but it's not there. It's not written there. I'm just pointing out that based on everything else we see about how awful this was, and that there was a curse to be placed on Canaan so that he would serve the other two brothers, I think is interesting. Okay. Um, I'm going to put it right there. Just leave it right there because hopefully this gives you a lot of things to ponder on. I wouldn't go making going on a book tour, with your truth about this matter and create your storyline. Though I've probably created a lot for you already, or at least put some ideas in your mind. My fault, right? Um, but I do want to point out after this curse was delivered and the blessing, that in verse 28 it says that Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and so all the days of Noah were 950 years. And we see something very interesting post flood that happens, where it was not unusual for a man to live to be 800, 900, 1,000 years old prior to this event. We're going to see, well, actually not slowly, but quite rapidly, we're going to see the years greatly decrease. And in my opinion, the reason for that has to do with this very changed Earth that now they're a part of. So what am I saying there? Or what possible inference do we have? It could well be that man in a higher pressure, thicker atmosphere environment, over time would develop the ability to live longer. Just sticking that out there, okay? And I've seen some creation scientists try to experiment with those kind of ideas by creating highly pressurized, denser atmosphere environments for animals, for example, in a controlled, container. You know, basically building a small, what they would hope by a guess, pre-diluvian, pre-flood like environment. And so I'm going to tell you what some of these guys saw. I don't know if you can actually make, again, a proof for this, but they had some of the animals and organisms they put into these environments had great lifespans, much like many times longer than normal, average. And you could say, well, that could have been just luck of the draw or whatever, or maybe there's something to this, but it may actually take generations to actually readapt, to the changes, that radical of a change in an environment. My guess is it's probably easier to release, as in this case, where the atmosphere became very light, and Noah, much to his surprise, ends up getting drunk just after having some wine, and at least this incident, which was actually pretty awful, which I would think that such an incident would have happened maybe before if there was a whole drunkenness thing. And that's why I say I think this is unusual and a surprise. But I wanted to point that out. So if and it's not, if you go out there and take somebody who's not a believer, believes the Earth's millions of years old, and you were to walk them through everything that I just said, you're probably just going to get, a bunch of laughter, right? Okay. So this is actually more of a comfort to those of you who are believers, but wrestle sometimes, from a scientific point of view with certain things. And you might say, wait a minute, this causes me maybe to rethink some of the things that I'm told by science that have to be true. And now I see evidences for something maybe of a more radical nature. I'm going to leave you with one other last thought on this, and it has to do with carbon 14 dating, because science uses carbon 14 dating, so that's just basically a decay, quote unquote decay constant, to be able to figure out how old uh, things are based on levels of carbon 14. So carbon 14 dating. So when people date something, some old bone or something, that they find, in a dig or whatever, they'll date it using carbon 14 dating, and usually they come up with these very large spans. And they'll tell you that for accuracy, and it's kind of laughable here, okay, but for accuracy, you can only carbon 14 dating works best with incredibly old things. So so there's kind of a presumption, about old things, and then carbon 14 dating them accurately, and so it's like, but whenever you push anything back millions and millions of years, aren't we kind of really saying we don't know? And that's why we have to push things back that far. Anyway, that's my view sometimes of these pseudoscientists, and some of their reasoning is it's like your answer to everything is to push it, you know, um, out there, uh, because then who would dare challenge you? It's like, who's going to go back 100 million years and show you that you're a liar? Um, but I wanted to put that out there, because if you think about a diluvian situation or a flood situation, radically changing those constants on the earth, then with regards to dating, there's going to be this enormous gappage created by the flood because of something that happened very rapidly. And so if carbon 14 decay is not a constant because of different conditions, in other words, the Earth that we have today was not like the Earth in Noah's time, okay, before the flood. If it's that radically different, then what's going to happen is your spectrum, if you were to like plot all the carbon 14 datings onto a map, you're going to see this huge gap around 4,000 years ago. And so you can actually go out here, if you will, and prove this. If you were to go out and look at all the carbon 14 datings, you're going to see higher densities moving, well, they're spread, but you're going to start seeing this big spread in a lot of points past 4,000 years. You're going to see a kind of a gappage. You're going to have elements. Don't worry, there's going to be points. There'll be points in that 4,000 year range, and then they're going to start gathering up again and accelerating, moving more contemporary. But the reason for the whole spread, or what looks like millions of years, is actually caused by a radical uh, change to the environment, approximately 4,000 years ago. So again, you can go out there and try to share that with your unbelieving friends, and they will promptly laugh in your face. This is more again for the person who's scientifically has a scientific background, has become a believer in Jesus Christ, and now you feel kind of torn with all the things that you've been taught, in school, that have to be fact. They're not taught, these things aren't taught as theory, even. Okay? I wish they were taught as theory, But a lot of these things are going to be taught to you as fact, right? Just like the pterodactyl, it's not a theory anymore. It's a fact that the pterodactyl can't fly, and I hope that you can see that maybe we're wrong about that because we made some really bad assumptions. One of the biggest problems a lot of times when doing scientific um, guessing theories or even assumption is that whatever you base as your foundation, if you go from a certain point, and people will say we can go from this point because we know this is a fact. So fact, the Earth is millions and millions and millions of years old, and then you begin to extrapolate based on that fact. Uh, you end up your answers moving farther and farther out are further and further out from the truth than you can imagine, right? Because you're the thing at the very beginning that you tried to base everything on was so far off truth that you can't trust anything you built upon that afterwards as being accurate. Does that make sense? So, we need to take heart if you're like into sciences and you're struggling with some of these things that that maybe there's a radical thing that happened 4,000 years ago, and perhaps it's a linchpin to better knowledge about things. Um, and we kind of already covered this when we're talking about the pyramids. Um, that perhaps so we know the waters came up from the deep, and so some would say that the land masses of the earth were separated at that time, but a lot of people believe that the separation of the land masses came when God decided to disperse the people post the Tower of Babel. That would be another very radical thing that happened on the earth. In fact, some people think that it's possible that God actually expanded the earth at that time, made it a little bit bigger. Um, and of course broke the land masses apart. And anyway, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in scripture, and it's like, you got all that from one verse. That's crazy, right? But it's quite possible that you just saw in this thing where we just read one verse, but it's obvious from the following verses that there had to be a lot more in that than just what the verse said, because it's like, why would you curse? I mean, these guys had to have seen, themselves, without clothes on at some point in time. What was the big deal here? And it looks like, just with one verse, we actually had something very major happen. We don't know the full details, but it sure seems a lot bigger than what was written. So I don't want to get too extra biblical. These are just things to think about, right? But if you're scientifically minded, I'm hoping that I put you on a path to go investigate. Look up those first, find out when the first whatever, or who was the first, barbershop, who was the, whatever. And if you look at these things and you find out that a lot of them trace back to some 4,000 years, I'm hoping that you'll actually be amazed and you'll go, wait a minute, why is everything timing out at a time when the Bible tells us that these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated? Seems to me like there's an origin story here, and it happened 4,000 years ago. What was it? You know, was it an asteroid hitting the earth, or was it a worldwide flood that is recorded not only in the Bible but in several of the ancient texts from these dispersed people groups that built pyramids thousands of miles apart from each other? And how did they know how to build a giant tower to the heavens? Were these the early um, architects at Babel now dispersed uh, to all parts of the earth? Um, Things to think about, right? So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Different talk for me, and maybe not such a evangelical appeal, but something for believers, maybe to give them a little bit more confidence in what they read and how to kind of like look at things that they study scientifically and go, but if we look at this through the lens of something like the flood, maybe it can change our perspective on what we see and the layering. Are we seeing eons, lots and lots of time periods layering the earth, or are we seeing natural death based on how things would die in a cataclysmic worldwide flood, and then how, and with regards to what would settle first and how the layers would be built. you know it's like, does that make better sense, than what we tend to get taught um, in science class? Anyway, I'm gonna leave it there. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments.